Before I proceed with the actual content of this video, which is unrelated to the previous topic and the other video, I have to explain why I changed the title of that video. Now, originally it was Bitches Be Crazy to Yo, and I changed it to a much less humorous gender and suicide terrorism and perspective. Now, the reason why I did that is pretty simple. I didn't want to do it. Now, originally I came up with a title. I thought, here's a way of combining something interesting as a title as well as a bit of dry humor, which for those of you who don't know, I'm well renowned for, into the title while still really getting at the topic at hand. And everything was fine until YouTube revoked my monetization rights on that particular video, so it's not monetizable. This is not the first time this has happened. It seems to be triggered by either certain pictures, so maybe the Justin Trudeau picture triggered it, or the B word, which you're not supposed to be using because that counts as hate speech or doesn't follow community guidelines. Either way, I need the ad revenue from that video or any other video, and so I'm forced to, due to the constraints of YouTube, to take that down. Hopefully in time it'll autocorrect, but I'll lose a lot of AdSense revenue in the process as views accrue and come in and they're not monetized. So thank you, YouTube, for crushing my creativity and making a really nice video title that made sense and at the same time was humorous, not viable anymore. But that's the way it is. And in the future, I think really have to think about my titles carefully to see whether or not YouTube will consider it hate speech or breaking community guidelines. Whatever. Moving on to the topic at hand. Today, I'm going to be talking about prostitution in the animal kingdom, as well as to a more limited extent in the human animal kingdom, for a number of reasons. Now, the reasons why I want to talk about this is because it's becoming an increasingly well-documented phenomenon in certain species. And even though I'm only talking about 3 species of animals in this case, or 4 if you include human beings, it's probable that, in fact, very likely, that many animal species that are reasonably intelligent engage in this sort of barter system of sex for resources. Now, many of you already know about the 2005 Capuchin monkey experiment at Yale that was essentially done for, I would say, economic purposes above all. This guy, Keith Chen, I guess an evolutionary economist, if you want to call him that, where he was examining principles of altruism and trade, and of course, eventually sex came up. Male monkeys would trade food for sex from females. So that's pretty well known. But what I want to spend a fair amount of time on talking about, is before I move on to Adélie penguins, are chimpanzees, the common chimpanzee. Recently, fairly recently, late 1990s, there was some documentation and increased documentation over the years that certain chimpanzees engage in male chimpanzees engage for meat, in a meat for sex kind of barter system. It's been observed in West African chimpanzees, and apparently I'm posting a link to all the stuff I'm talking about as usual. Apparently it's a bit controversial because you seem to have 2 camps. Primatologists and anthropologists who study the West African chimpanzees versus the East African. Apparently this has been only rarely documented in Eastern African chimpanzees, but it's fairly well acknowledged in West African chimpanzees that the males and chimpanzees do hunt for meat, and contrary to what a lot of religious vegans claim, males will trade meat for sexual favors from females. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it possibly, at least according to the scientists involved, might have implications for us trying to understand how human beings evolved. After all, if a female trades sex for meat, in essence, she's saving calories and energy expenditure, and there's some suggestion, you can read the articles, that maybe this is how our system of trade and barter for sex began. Maybe not. Chimpanzees are not human beings, but who knows? In any event, it absolutely is a form of prostitution where meat serves as money, and the same thing you had with the capuchin monkeys, which are much dumber than chimpanzees, basically spending money or grapes or jello for sex. And invariably, because of sexual dimorphism, it is the male who trades the meat or the food, in the case of the fruit and capuchin monkeys, to the female. This could have interesting implications because it implies maybe that's the way this sort of trade and barter system started with human beings. Maybe in some sort of hominid ancestor, such as Homo erectus or Australopithecus, well, probably Homo erectus, because that's probably when we know hominids began to eat meat, consume meat. Maybe after a hunt, they would, females would spread their legs for an extra portion of the meat. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of the animals, before I talk about the implications of all of this, because there's a kind of somewhat separate topic, are the Adélie penguins, which have been documented as to engage in prostitution of sorts. Now, instead of food, prostitution, the currency of prostitution in Adélie penguins is the stone, or our stones. Now, have a little listen to the audio narrative of this BBC. It's only a minute long.
All penguins are essentially monogamous. The success of relationships usually equates to success in breeding. In Adélie's, the penguin equivalent of divorce and even infidelity is not unusual. The females will even partake in penguin prostitution. The currency of prostitution penguin style is stones. They will mate with single males in return for the small stones essential to build their nests. And the cost of these favours? Well, scientists from Stirling University monitored one female who copulated with a male just once and took 62 nest stones in payment.
So those are a lot of stones in exchange for one act of copulation. But what's really interesting about the Adélie penguins is that they are avians. They're not mammals, and yet they are still engaging in this sex for resources principle. The other interesting thing, and once again this will be in the low bar, regarding Adélie penguins is they do other things as well. So in this article called "The Dark Truth About Adélie Penguins Was Kept Secret for More Than 100 Years," and the topic is relevant to the topic that will come later. I'm going to read it out. Aren't penguins the cutest? With all their waddling and flappy little arms, Adélie penguins look particularly adorable, standing at just 70 centimeters with beady little eyes. But don't be fooled by their charming appearance. When Dr. George Murray Levick made his observations on their sexual behavior in 1911 and 1912, it was deemed too inappropriate to ever be published. You might consider that standard in prudish Edwardian England, but even by today's standards, some of it is pretty extreme. Far before the sexual liberation of the 1960s, penguins were ahead of the curve by engaging in promiscuous sex between unpaired male and female penguins. There were also records of homosexual sex between male penguins. So far, no problems by modern standards, but wait, on his Antarctic expedition, Levick also observed instances of Adélie penguins engaging in rape, gang rape, sexual and physical abuse of chicks, as well as necrophilia with penguins, some of which had died the previous year. Levick blamed this astonishing depravity on quote-unquote hooligan males. So shocked, he wrote down his observations in Greek, so only educated gentlemen could understand. His code seemed to work, and his work wasn't published until 2012. And then finally, in 1998, more penguin depravity came to light when people observed Adélie penguins using stones to pimp out females for prostitution. They also reported that some of the prostitute penguins tricked the males into thinking they would have sex by performing an elaborate courtship ritual, then run away with their stones. Now, this bears some resemblance to the human ritual. That's why I mentioned the penguins. Think about the dating ritual. In theory, you go out with a female, you pay for the date, you pay for meals, you pay for a movie, a film, whatever, and you do so in the hopes that you're going to have intercourse with her. But no, she holds out, and she continues to hold out, and a couple of dates go by and nothing's happening. Hopefully by then you have the sense to no longer pay and just leave her be, but it seems that even female penguins are willing to trick the males into pimping them out for stones, or basically stealing stones from them without delivering on the goods, the sexual goods. Many similarities here. Now, why am I talking about all of this animal prostitution? Well, we all know that prostitution is fairly common in human beings. They do call it the oldest profession in the world, and that is for good reason. But the thrust and gist of what I'm trying to get at here is I want to talk about the sort of educational application of this. I've mentioned now 3 different species: capuchin monkeys, the common chimpanzee, and Adélie penguins. And here we have, in various instances, in various circumstances, perhaps in the case of only West African chimpanzees, but nonetheless it's documented, a kind of prostitution, a barter system of exchanging resources, which for basic animals, food is the greatest resource, for sex, and even a bit of a con job on the part of the Adélie penguins, the females. Now, when we think about human beings are the animal that we probably have the most data on. We are the animals that we have the most information on. We are the animals that have probably been studied more than any other animal. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't think so. And yet, when it comes to these issues that are all well and good to document in wild animals, non-human animals, with the exception of Dr. George Murray Levick, because he deemed the behavior inappropriate to document, for his time at least, we don't talk about it. So before I proceed, let me first say that I have no illusions and that what I'm about to say is even in the slightest possible. That is, I don't think it could ever be implemented realistically. But I believe that at a very early age, in terms of education, perhaps at 10, 11, 12, certainly at 13, boys and girls, human beings, should be receiving what I would call an evolutionary sexual education. A sexual education that just doesn't go into the physiology of it all, but in particular the psychology of it and what motivates men and women respectively. Now, we have issues in adult society of talking about what motivates men and women openly. And one of the reasons why we don't talk about it is that more often than not, it seems at least to put women in a bad light. But that all depends on your perspective. After all, if we try to be objective and try to just look at things as they are, there's nothing particularly good or bad about, say, female Adélie penguins stealing stones without delivering the promised good of sex, copulation with the male penguins. It is what it is. It's just nature in operation. And if we can keep that in mind, we don't need to necessarily say, well, women want men with resources and will sometimes, engage in this kind of behavior. They will try to get resources without delivering the goods. We can just see that as a reproductive strategy that's fairly mindless. This is all autopilot. Instead, both boys and girls, but in particular boys, are left to just swim in a metaphorical cloud of ignorance, an ocean of ignorance, not knowing what's going on. How many of us took half a lifetime, a quarter of a lifetime, to realize the things we did, and only after observing, experiencing, and then actually doing research on things published to try to understand and connect the dots? One of the great failings, I believe, of any educational system is in not educating young human beings in these particular aspects of their behavior. Now, much is made of being practical, and they don't learn practical skills in school. But what more practical skills, if you want to call them that, or what more practical pieces of information and knowledge could they possibly learn than this? This behavior for males and females is going to determine for the rest of their lives how they interact with the other sex. And the autopilot drives, they don't help to give you the information, because you're merely acting upon it. Maybe men in particular would approach these issues with greater circumspection if they knew what was going on. So many men simply believe that women just can like them for who they are, or think if they're nice guys. They don't think that resources play a role at all. This is, of course, delusional. That's not how any sort of reproduction works, and certainly not human reproduction. But because we shy away from examining human beings as animals, because we think of ourselves as exceptional, we don't think it's worth our time to examine these things. And so to the extent that it is examined, it's left to the rather obscure field of evolutionary psychology, And even to the extent that evolutionary psychology is trying to, I suppose, get more public ground, it tends to focus in on other things. Remember the discussion that C.S. MGTOW had with I don't remember his name, the professor from, I believe, SUNY New Paltz, on evolutionary psychology 2.0, where there's kind of a stripping away of the sort of sexually dimorphic things, which are the core, the very heart of evolutionary psychology, to talk about other things that are just unrelated to that. We can talk sort of about intuitive physics. That's great, and that's mildly interesting, but the power of evolutionary psychological explanations has always lain not in the things that are ancillary to the sexual reproduction of our species, but has lain in the explanations related to sexual reproduction, both for males and females. The differences in size and shape, and in particular the reproductive cost. Notice, in every species that bears a larger reproductive cost, the sex which bears the larger reproductive cost, you see at least the potential for this sort of behavior, even in avians and penguins, and you see it in chimpanzees, right? So pregnancy, whether a penguin apparently, or a chimpanzee, or a capuchin, or a human, that has a huge reproductive cost. Men can get away with more. So they're the ones, of course, that court and are sexually bigger and stronger and compete with each other and so on and so forth. This is basic knowledge, and all of us know this by now. But why isn't this taught in school? Why don't 13-year-olds learn this? Now, before I hear religious claptrap about, oh, that would be blasphemous, well, who cares? The religion has nothing to do with science. We are doing ourselves a disservice at the lowest level. And I had a discussion a couple of weeks ago with a red pill chemist, and I agree with him that chemistry, biology, cell biology, all these things should be taught. But I would argue that it's even that could be taught later, because that kind of stuff is not going to alter the psychology, or at least the reactions people have to their own instincts, the way these revelations, and then in that context they are revelations, could potentially alter the minds of these young people. Evolution is taught, in general, as something quite distant from human beings. After all, you tell someone, well, Homo erectus about 2 million years ago, these are just numbers that don't mean anything. And rather than identifying certain traits and forms of behavior that they themselves can identify with, we just talk about it as an abstract, far removed from human beings. And we are doing ourselves a disservice. Of course, instead, we dance around the issues. Take a look at the anti-feminists, and I tend to be pretty critical of them, and I don't expect them to change, but they are effectively, in their approach to feminists, and I think there's some use to it, I've said this before, but they're putting band-aids on cancer, right? They're putting band-aids on life-threatening injuries. I don't know if there's a resolution to these gender dynamic problems that we face. And of course, that would include thinking about an interpretation, because a resolution could be interpreted one way or another. For some people, it would be considered a resolution, others not so much. But it seems clear to me that evading this topic of human evolution, of human biology, trying to circumvent it, is not going to be a solution. There can be no resolution without knowledge and information. So these are things that I think actually young people, teenagers, both boys and girls, would find very interesting, because they could relate to it. I mean, they're a frothing bubble bath of hormones at that age anyway. They would understand why it is they're reacting and how it is they're reacting. But this is seen as ancillary or even tertiary in some regards. I disagree. And so this approach that's been taken to, say, studying chimpanzee prostitution and studying Adélie penguin prostitution, among other things, as well as capuchin monkeys, the same approach needs to be taken when it comes to human beings. We really do need to look at ourselves as animals and understand ourselves in the animal context. We tend to get lost in ideas of sort of special snowflakeness, as I would call it, uniqueness. But to the extent that human beings are unique, we're only unique as a matter of degree. That is to say, yeah, we have well-developed brains, but that's just a question of being somewhat more developed than X animal, right? It's not that we have certain features that are absolutely would be inconceivable for other animals, given certain circumstances and environmental shifts over the course of evolution. Now, of course, it doesn't help at all that we artificially differentiate between such things as short-term exchange of resources, which is then officially called prostitution in human beings, versus marriage, which is essentially long-term prostitution. However you want to term it, we like to artificially differentiate these things for our own psychological well-being, I suppose, to make ourselves feel better, that it's somehow different. The only difference being the duration. That's not helping. So really what we need to do is to get past the obfuscation. And I realize that that is probably an impossible task, maybe a Herculean task, if Herculean were to fall somewhere below the impossible level. But the way I see it, more and more evidence is coming to the surface with regards to animals, even avians of all types of animals, that prostitution is alive and real, and we refuse to really look at it in depth in human society, right? We acknowledge it exists. For example, Germany, prostitution is legal, but nobody's really trying to understand how it really works in human beings. I have yet to see, I've looked for extensive research done on human prostitution and the difference between short-term prostitution and long-term prostitution, such as in marriage. But these things make people feel uncomfortable, and you can't even have them discussed in an academic environment. So I'm not too positive about this, but that is to say I don't have a positive outlook as to this being discussed. To my knowledge, really only some people, MGTOW content producers, talk about this because we're not particularly interested in not offending people, and we find it interesting. I certainly find it interesting. Until a few weeks ago, I was unaware that any penguin species engage in this sort of behavior, let alone necrophilia, but there you have it. Many species engage in all kinds of behavior, almost all of it related to reproduction and survival. And if we don't do that and take the same approach to human beings, if there is any resolution at all, we're definitely going to be closing the door shut. Now, on a final note, I think part of the issue here, particularly for the anti-feminist camp, it takes someone like Sargon of Akkad, who very much is, I guess I would put it charitably, sort of attached to sort of enlightenment values, sort of optimistic enlightenment values about human beings. But for all the good the European Enlightenment did, it was just off the mark on so many other issues. And so optimism, well, maybe, but the only way we can be optimistic is if we are realistic. And many of the assessments the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers made about human beings simply turned out to be inaccurate. From, say, Hume with his raw form of empiricism, which is just fun. If you take, say, quantum mechanics, you can't really apply empiricism to quantum mechanics as an example. Many things were wrong. The noble savage myth, and I will be making an extensive video, I have it planned at least, on the myth of the noble savage. All of these things. And so by attaching oneself to these views, as say Sargon does, you manage to avoid having to deal with a somewhat sometimes ugly reality, biological reality. The idea that biology not only plays a role, but perhaps the most important role in our development as human beings and as our behavior as human beings is not one that's easy to swallow. And of course, this isn't the first time I've talked about it, but I kind of secretly hope and wish that the more mainstream channels and the anti-feminists start incorporating this stuff, because otherwise it's kind of a lost cause. I have no issue, for example, people have asked me, why don't I go on with Sargon and talk about my views and defend my views? Well, I don't have a problem defending my views. I'm always open to new evidence. In fact, I started working on a recent video where I will be revising some of my views, but to my knowledge, he's not even very well informed on the subjects, just as an example. So If we keep this strictly to political, as Coltane implied and outright stated in this video on divorce incentives, I just don't see anything changing. Hey, but maybe that's not what people want. For my purpose, I hope this video was informative and it gave you a deeper look at things. I certainly find it very interesting that at the very least West African chimpanzees have been documented to engage in exchange of meat for resources. I could very well imagine this is completely hypothetical. This isn't an actual hypothesis. Say in our Homo erectus ancestors, this scenario going down where the male brought home some not insubstantial amount of meat and the woman offered copulation in exchange for resources. It might be, in fact, the very foundation for hypergamy, a way of the female, who has the more expensive reproductive costs, of circumventing some of those costs by getting a male chimpanzee, or in the case of the Adélie penguins, a male penguin, to essentially buy up some of the costs for her. And who knows, maybe this is the origin of female hypergamy in human beings. This would obviously require much more study. It would require study by professionals, but at the very least, it is a thought and something that we can consider for the future. So once again, I'm sorry for changing the title of my previous video, but given YouTube and its bullshittiness, I'm forced to. So much for a witty and applicable title. Everyone take care and enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you in all likelihood soon. Bye-bye.